hemochromatosis for the last couple of years, and I'm going to give an overview of the work we've been doing at the University of Exeter today. As you're all probably very well aware, hereditary hemochromatosis is a disorder of iron overload. It's the most common genetic disorder in Northern Europeans, being largely responsible by the HFE gene, with the highest risk group being the C282Y homozygotes. And it can be prevented if spotted early. It can be easily treated with phlebotomy. And common symptoms of hemochromatosis include liver disease, diabetes, joint problems and joint pain, but also tiredness and lethargy. So hereditary hemochromatosis is being commonly most seen in older men, with women thought to have some natural protection or natural treatment from hemochromatosis due to menstrual cycles and premenopause. It's previously thought that the penetrance of these genotypes to clinical disease was quite low, with estimates showing that around 10% of homozygous males may develop serious disease. Within hemochromatosis, many people may be diagnosed late or may be misdiagnosed because common symptoms such as joint pain and fatigue might be misdiagnosed as usual signs of aging, recommended for hemochromatosis. So within the UK, we're very blessed with a very large cohort that we've been working on to research hemochromatosis, and that's called the UK Biobank. So the UK Biobank is a very large community volunteer sample of over 500,000 participants. People were recruited from 22 assessment centres throughout England, Wales and Scotland. And the people within UK Biobank were aged between 40 and 70 years at baseline. So within this particular study, people had to fill in very detailed questionnaires on their medical history, their lifestyle, and they also undertook a full day of assessments. So things like their blood pressure and ECG, physiological measurements were assessed. Also, all the people in Biobank provided blood samples and had a full genetic screen. So all the people in Biobank have been genotyped for the common C282Y and H63D hemochromatosis genotypes. It's a registry in the UK and also the death records. And for half the people within this cohort, we also have primary care records. So we have information on the general practices they've visited. So this study is a really, really large study of community genotyped hemochromatosis people. So we've particularly focused on the people of European ancestries who have the the highest prevalence of the hemochromatosis genotypes. So we focused on over 450 people with a European descent. And of those, there are 2,890 C282Y homozygotes, or a prevalence of 0.6%, which is 1 in 156 people in the UK Biobank that tend to have this high-risk genotype. And this study is actually the largest cohort of people in the world with hemochromatosis mutations that have been measured. So it's 10 times larger than the largest previous study of hemochromatosis genotypes. So thinking about the prevalence of the hemochromatosis genotypes within UK Biobank, we see that although it's a volunteer study and it's made up of very healthy individuals, the prevalence is very similar to other studies in the UK. So we see that the C282Y allele frequency is 7.3% within UK Biobank, and this is very comparable to other UK-based studies which have shown prevalences between 6 and 7%. Similarly, the prevalence of the C282Y homozygous frequency is 0.64%, and that's very similar to a 0.68% in Welsh blood donors. So, looking at the diagnosis of hemochromatosis in the UK Biobank by the end of follow-up, we see that only a small subset of the C282Y homozygotes have actually been diagnosed with hemochromatosis. So, by the end of follow-up, 25% of all the men have been diagnosed with a mean diagnosis age of 55 years, but only 12.5% of all the females were diagnosed, with a slightly later age of diagnosis of 58 years. So the vast majority of these people are remaining undiagnosed. Looking at the characteristics of UK Biobank participants at baseline, the age is very similar across genotypes, But interestingly, we see that the people who are obese, that tends to be less likely in the C2HY homozygotes compared to those with no mutations. Also, the C2HY homozygotes tend to have a slightly lower rate of drinking alcohol compared to those with no mutations. So we published some work in the BMJ a couple of years ago looking at hemochromatosis genotypes and common conditions. And what we found is that based on self-reported diseases at baseline, the male C2HY homozygotes had an increased risk of several different diseases, including a fourfold risk of liver disease, and also a doubling in the risk of osteoporosis, both rheumatoid and osteoarthritis, an increased risk of pneumonia, and also increased risk of type 1, type 2 diabetes combined. Interestingly though, the male homozygotes had a slightly decreased risk of coronary artery disease. Looking at the women in comparison, we only see an increased risk of osteoarthritis in the female C2HY homozygotes. So none of the other outcomes we examined were increased in the females. It was just this osteoarthritis, which showed a 30% increase in risk. So within Biobank, we've also looked at overall penetrance to any disease. And so we combined a number of common diseases. So we looked at diagnosis of either hemochromatosis itself, liver disease, liver cancer, osteoarthritis, rheumatoid arthritis, and diabetes. And what we find is that there's excess disease in male C2HY homozygotes, which is found in 1 in 5 of the males. And in females, this excess disease is only seen in 1 in 10. And looking at this graph here as well, we see that with increasing age, there's more increasing disease, and that's the case across all the genotypes, obviously, that there's much more disease in the C2HY homozygotes compared to the heterozygotes or those with no mutations. We've also published another study looking at the older age group within UK Biobank. So we've done a sub-analysis of over 200,000 people aged between 60 and 70 in UK Biobank. And we looked at the risk of frailty. So frailty here is a measure including things like muscle weakness, slow walking speed, and tiredness. And we find that both male and female C2HY homozygotes have got an increased likelihood of being frail. And we also see that in the male homozygotes, they've got an increased likelihood of having chronic pain at old ages. More recently, we've published on the risk of liver disease and liver cancer in the people with the homozygous genotypes. So the risk of liver cancer is increased in those clinically diagnosed with hereditary hemochromatosis. But do we know, is this due to perhaps heavy drinking, so hepatitis, or could it just be an artifact of the fact that hemochromatosis patients have lots of clinical tests? So it was unclear to us whether the hemochromatosis genotype was associated with excess liver cancer. And previous research has shown that lifetime incidence of severe liver disease, which can be defined as cirrhosis or hepatocellular cancer, was thought to be 9% in untreated male homozygotes. So within our study, we found just over 1,000 C2HY homozygous men. And within these men in UK Biobank, there were 21 cases of incident liver cancer. Of these, 14% died from liver cancer itself. And the really interesting thing here is that 10 of those men, so 10 of the 21, weren't diagnosed with hemochromatosis at baseline. So around half of all the people that get, of the C2HY homozygotes that get liver cancer, weren't diagnosed with hemochromatosis prior to the liver cancer diagnosis. So this graph here is showing the increase in risk of liver cancer in the C2HY homozygotes compared to those with no mutations. And we see over a 10-fold increase in risk in liver cancer in the males. We also did some sensitivity analysis to look at those that had and hadn't been diagnosed with hemochromatosis. And we see that the same risks exist even in those that haven't been diagnosed with hemochromatosis. So looking at the risk of liver disease in males, we see a significantly increased risk of liver disease in the male homozygotes of almost 3 times. And we also see different subtypes of liver disease increased. So alcoholic liver disease is much more common in the male homozygotes, and cirrhosis and fibrosis as well is 6 times as common. So doing some disease projections, we looked at the proportion of people, or proportion of males, that would be predicted to develop disease by the age of 75 years. So we find that for liver disease, by the age of 75, 20% of all the male homozygotes would get liver disease, which compares to around 10% in the general population. And for liver cancer, 7% of all the male homozygotes would develop liver cancer, compared to just 0.6% in the general population. So this is an excess of 6.6% of liver cancer in the male homozygotes compared to those with no mutations. So we also found an increased risk in all-cause mortality. So there was a 24% increase in the risk of death from any cause in those with the mutations compared to those without. And we, again, at age 75, disease projections show an increased risk or an excess risk of 4.4% in the homozygotes compared to those with no mutation. So in females, interestingly, we see no significant increase in risk of liver cancer, of liver disease, or of all-cause death. And we get quite a lot of good media coverage for this paper as well. In the UK, we had quite a lot of traction on the risk of hemochromatosis genotypes and liver cancer. Recently published a study looking at brain iron imaging and dementia risk in hemochromatosis genotypes, because iron's been shown to be linked to dementia and other neurodegenerative diseases, with iron thought to have roles in oxygen transport, myelin production, and metabolism of neurotransmitters. So we wanted to look at associations between hemochromatosis genotypes and brain features on MRIs, and also risk of incident dementia. So a subset of people in UK Biobank have got MRI images. So 28,000 people have been imaged in the Biobank sample. 206 of these were the C2H2I homozygotes. And what we see is that in the C2H2I homozygotes, there's a lot more brain iron deposition in regions associated with dementia. So this plot here shows the risk of several outcomes, including dementia and delirium, according to hemochromatosis genotypes. And what we find is that in addition to seeing this increased iron deposition in the MRI scans, male homozygous individuals also have an increased risk of incident dementia. So we see an 83% increase in the risk of dementia, and we also see an 82% increase in the risk of delirium, which is quite often associated with dementia. However, we don't see this in the women, we see it in the men only. And we looked at a few other outcomes such as mild cognitive impairment and the risk of stroke, but we don't see an increase in the risk of either stroke or cognitive impairment in these individuals. So it seems that men with the homozygous mutation develop substantially more marked brain iron deposition in dementia-relevant areas, and they're much more likely to be diagnosed with dementia during follow-up in hospitalisation data. But a lot more research is needed in this area to see whether early ascertainment of hemochromatosis and reduction in iron in the homozygotes may prevent or may limit associations with dementia and brain-related pathologies. So to summarise UK Biobank, it's a fantastic resource because it's the largest study of C2H2I homozygotes in the world. It has very detailed genotype and phenotype information. A few things to consider though is that the sample consists of healthy volunteers, but we have shown that the mutation prevalence is very similar to other studies. Another drawback of Biobank is that there are no measures on the blood iron levels. So we know people's genotype for hemochromatosis, we know about their associated outcomes and morbidity, but we don't actually know about their sort of objective iron loading. And also at the moment, primary care data is only available for half a sample, but in the future, we hope that this data will be updated. So in conclusion, it seems that HFE C2H2I homozygotes have substantial excess morbidity in males compared to those that don't have the mutation. So we see a twofold increase in risk of frailty, of diabetes, of osteoarthritis, of osteoporosis, also a twofold increase in risk in dementia and delirium, And we see a 3-fold increase in risk of liver disease and over a 10-fold increase in risk of liver cancer. However, in the females and in the heterozygous individuals, risk increases are much more modest. So this really highlights the need for much earlier diagnosis of hemochromatosis and improved methods for case finding. Just to mention, so we've recently been funded for a study within the UK to work on hemochromatosis for the next 3 to 4 years. So just to mention our future plans in terms of research objectives, we're going to use the new data from Biobank with much more follow-up to answer some of the unknown questions about the prognosis by HH genotypes, especially in women and in the heterozygotes. So as women become older and time moves on from menopause, are there outcomes associated with people with the genotypes? Future research is also going to explore barriers to diagnosis. So why is it some people are diagnosed early and some people aren't? And what are the preceding symptoms and factors that people tend to go to their doctor about in order to get diagnosed? And future research also will hopefully do some economic evaluation and modelling for possible options to improve earlier diagnosis and screening strategies. And lastly, just to say thank you to all of the co-authors that I've worked with for all this hemochromatosis research. Thank you to UK Biobank for the data, and also thank you to the funders in the UK, the Medical Research Council and NIHR. And I'm happy to take any questions.